So this week we're going to talk about the Chinese Revolution, and China for a long time had not had a Marxist movement. You know, Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, but really up until the Russian Revolution in 1917, there was even very little talk of Marxism in China. Mainly because Marx was writing about the proletariat, but there wasn't a proletariat in China. It was largely a peasant society, largely illiterate. There were very few literate people. They were a very impoverished society. But and so when Marx was writing about liberation of the proletariat, it didn't really cement with people. One of the first nationalist movements in China, one of the strongest ones, I wouldn't say the first, was the Boxer rebellions. And what that was is those were people associated with Chinese medieval culture and Chinese feudalism revolting against the West's influence in China, largely. And they were going around and attacking missionaries, Christian missionaries, and in the defense of native Chinese religion. They were destroying opium distribution centers, which that was one way the British colonialists were able to enslave the Chinese people, was through massive opium addiction. Because once you're addicted to opium, you'll work for drugs. So there was the Boxer Rebellion, but China was ruled by an emperor who was a comprador of imperialism, was an ally of the British and let the British run the show. But then there was the nationalist movement, or the Guomindang movement, that began. It was led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he had the three guiding principles of his belief, and they were democracy, independence for China, independence of China from foreign countries, and a better livelihood for the people. Right? Those were the three principles. And also the democracy, if you actually look at the definition he used for democracy, he was talking also in terms of not just political democracy, but kind of a social democratic feature. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he was a nationalist. He was definitely, kind of, friend of the poor, but he was definitely not a Marxist. And he made a point of not being a Marxist. But I know that the suit that we associate with Mao, the Mao suit that Mao wore, that was actually Sun Yat-sen's suit. Mao just wore it after Sun Yat-sen. But that was the clothes that Sun Yat-sen wore, and it was, very simple clothes to make the point that he was a man of the people. After the Russian Revolution, among Sun Yat-sen's nationalist movement, which was strong at one of the few universities in China, a section of that movement, there's a professor named Chen Tu-Hui, I believe is Chen Tu-Hui, and he was a supporter of the Russian Revolution, and he wrote articles in academic journals in defense of the Russian Revolution. And he and a small circle of followers who were within the Chinese nationalist movement formed the Chinese Communist Party. And the small circle included Mao Tse-Tung, who was the librarian at the college, as well as a lot of other folks. Mao Tse-Tung, interestingly enough, reluctantly joined the party because he was an anarchist at the time. And Mao Tse-Tung, there was also Peng Tu-Si. There were a number of elements. It was a very small group. The first founding Congress of the Chinese Communist Party had less than 20 people, and they met in the basement of the girls' dormitory at the college because they hoped that no one would find them there. But they were found anyway, and halfway through they were all arrested for starting sedition. Which the same year that happened, don't take this as just the primitive Chinese, because the same year in the U.S. that happened at the Communist Party's Congress in 1921 in the U.S. They had the same thing. William C. Foster in Michigan, they had their conference in Michigan, and they were all arrested and charged for that in Michigan in the U.S. It was 20 people. It was a small group. And, however, they did get a lot of assistance from the Communist International. And the Communist International, based on the principles of Marxism and Leninism, right, was not just anti-capitalist, but also very anti-imperialist, because imperialism was the stage of capitalism. So the Communist International overwhelmingly supported the Chinese nationalist movement for independence. Dr. Sun Yat-sen met with Lenin. They shook hands, had photo ops. you know, and you know, made a point. Dr. Sun Yat-sen overwhelmingly liked Lenin. They politically were not in agreement, but they allied themselves. Sun Yat-sen even applied for the Chinese Nationalist Party to have a place in the Communist International, but was rejected on the grounds that they were not a communist party. And they weren't communists. I mean, the Chinese Nationalists, they were kind of left-wing populists. And Sun Yat-sen died. And in the Communist International, there was a heavy debate about it, and it really brought out the difference between Trotsky and Stalin, or the left opposition and the right wing of the party. Because the position of Stalin, Bukharin, and the right wing of the Communist International was that the Chinese Communist Party should dissolve itself into the Nationalist Party, into the Guomindang. Whereas the position of Trotsky and the left wing was that the Communist Party should remain an independent organization, should align with the Guomindang, but at the same time start building unions. There were railroad strikes. Just as there was gradually a proletariat coming, there were railroads being built throughout China, and railroad workers were going on strike, and railroad unions were being built that were aligned with the Communist Party. And Trotsky was calling for the independence of the Chinese Communist Party, whereas Bukharin and Stalin were calling for, you know, just following the nationalist movement. They, the independence, the people who called for the independence, including the founder, Chen Tu-si, and then eventually Tu Huo, I guess. It's kind of hard to pronounce, and then Peng Tu-shi, who eventually became the leader of the left opposition in China. They aligned themselves with Trotsky internationally, and Trotsky. I mean, China. The question of China was a determining question. And, I know in the U.S. when James P. Cannon, the founder of the Socialist Workers' Party, was kicked out of the Communist Party of the USA, they had all these witnesses to testify against him. He was kicked out for being a Trotskyite. And one of the witnesses who got up, was the head of the Communist Party's publishing company. And they asked him, you know, do you have evidence that he's a Trotskyite? And he said, well, no. And he said, has he been buying the books of Trotsky? And he said, well, no. And they said to him, well, you know, how do you know? Why are you here testifying that he is a Trotskyite? He says, well, he's bought every book we have on China, and that's clearly a Trotskyite subject. And that was kind of, you know, that kind of showed. I mean, much of Trotsky's early writings from like the first 5 years of the Communist International were all about making the case that the Chinese Communist Party should be independent and should not align itself solely with the nationalist capitalist party, but should define itself in independence. It was based on Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which is the idea that in the age of imperialism, the nationalist bourgeoisie cannot be the basis for a revolution. That a revolution has to, you know, that breaks a country free from imperialism has to be led by the proletariat. Whereas, you know, Stalin was believing that you have a two-stage revolution. You first have to have your national democratic revolution, and then after you've established a national democratic revolution and had capitalism, then after you've freed from imperialism and had your national democratic movement, then you can move towards socialism. So that the Chinese, they shouldn't have even been talking about socialism. That just wasn't on the agenda. You're a communist, and so that was the ideological difference that really defined, you know, and Stalin was for socialism in one country, and the Chinese should declare independence and win their independence. So the two factions that emerged were not the only two factions. There was the faction that was loyal to the Communist International, which was the right wing. Then there was the left opposition, which was the founder of the party and Peng Tu-shi. But then there was also a third faction, interestingly enough, which was led by Mao Tse-Tung, which disagreed with both of them. And they had the nickname the Rifle Faction. They called them the Rifle Faction, because Mao Tse-Tung was organizing peasants, whereas the one section wanted to organize workers. All right, that was the left section. The right section just became staff members of the Nationalist Party, whereas Mao Tse-Tung's faction, they went to the Hunan province, and Mao Tse-Tung was writing all these disagreements with the rest of the party, saying that these peasants are a source of anger, and that was his thing. He was organizing peasant associations and peasant strikes and peasants, and he said his basic message was the peasants are so full of anger and hatred. I mean, the life of a peasant was so miserable. I mean, starvation, you know, forced labor. I mean, it was basically slavery and all that. And he said these peasants are so full of anger, they can be the powder keg of the revolution.